Ukraine, 1 year on this day 1 year ago, 200,000 troops invaded Ukrainian territory trying to fulfill Vladimir Putin's goal of toppling the government of Volodymyr Zelensky. What was supposed to be a military operation limited in time has now become a protracted war that has killed tens of thousands of people and displaced millions of others. A large-scale war the likes continental Europe hasn't seen since 1945, that has profoundly transformed the global geopolitical landscape. In this special edition, we'll cross over live to Ukraine's capital, Kiev, where we'll join France 24's Mark Owen. And we'll also go to the front lines with our reporter, Catherine Norris Trent in Kherson. You can see them there, and we'll get the perspectives from Moscow and Cairo, far from the conflict, but still deeply affected by its consequences on the global economy. Well, welcome to France 24. I'm Charles Pellegrin, and thank you for joining us. The Kremlin thought that their so-called special military operation was supposed to be over within days, maybe weeks. But 1 year later, the war's objectives have changed. The aim to take over Kiev is no longer a priority, and the conflict has turned into a war for the Donbass in the east, Ukraine's industrial heartland. The fiercest fighting currently taking place in Bakhmut. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky marking the anniversary this Thursday on Twitter, describing a year of, quote, pain, sorrow, faith, and unity. Well, France 24's Yuka Royer and Fraser Jackson take us through the events of the past 365 days.
Before the sun was even up, Russian forces started attacking Ukraine from three sides. Explosions rang across the country, including the capital, Kiev. Tens of thousands of civilians fled their homes, heading west. The offensive started hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin declared what he called a special military operation, saying the aim was to protect people from abuse and to, quote, denazify and demilitarize the regime. Moscow also targeted the southern city of Odessa and blockaded its port on the Black Sea to try to cut Ukraine off from crucial food supplies. Attacking from the south, Russia seized the Kherson region near the Crimean Peninsula, which it had illegally annexed in 2014.
Our people, our Ukrainians, do not retreat, do not give up, do not stop the resistance.
Moscow expected Kiev to fall within days. Instead, it encountered stiff resistance from Ukrainian fighters as its own troops exposed their unpreparedness. After weeks of fighting, Russian forces pulled back, leaving a trail of atrocities in their wake. Footage of bodies strewn around the small town of Bucha on the outskirts of Kiev shocked the world. Ukraine's foreign minister called the massacre, quote, the most outrageous atrocity in the 21st century. Then, in April, came a Russian missile strike on a train station in the eastern city of Kramatorsk, which killed over 50 civilians. This as President Putin ordered a fresh offensive to capture all of the Donbass region. The Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, where a days-long siege took place, became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. Over the summer, the tide started to change. Ukraine recaptured Snake Island near Odessa, easing the pressure on the southwestern front. In the weeks that followed, its forces launched a counteroffensive in the east with the help of Western-supplied weapons and drones. They ended up recapturing several cities in Donetsk province. In September, pro-Russian officials staged referendums on whether to separate occupied territories in the Donbass from Ukraine. The votes were widely described as a sham, but Moscow declared the annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia nonetheless. In a major blow to Moscow, an explosion destroyed a part of a bridge linking Crimea to Russia. Moscow retaliated with a fresh offensive targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, a strategy they continue to use, resulting in millions facing frequent blackouts as winter approached. Then, in a major victory for Ukraine, it recaptured Kherson and parts of the Mykolaiv region, forcing Russian forces to fall back to the eastern side of the Dnipro River. The coming of the new year saw little change in the position of the front line, but on New Year's Day, a Ukrainian missile hit a building in Donetsk where Russian troops were staying, killing hundreds, according to Ukraine, and embarrassing Moscow. 2 weeks later, a stray Russian missile leveled an apartment block in Dnipro, killing over 40 people and leaving around 400 homeless. As the one-year anniversary of the start of the war approached, Ukraine readied itself for a fresh Russian offensive. Much of the fighting in 2023 has centered around the city of Bakhmut. With scores said to be dying every day, it has become the stage for the bloodiest battle in this war.
Well, let's head to Kiev now, the Ukrainian capital, constantly targeted by Russian airstrikes throughout the year, but still standing. France 24's Mark Owen is there reporting for us this Friday. Mark, give us a sense of what it's like to be there in Kiev right now.
Dobre ranko Kiev. Welcome to Kiev. It's a place that's really going about its life, business as usual, which was the message a year ago when the attacks started to happen. All the politicians headed to a bunker underneath the National War Museum, where we're coming live from later today. And Volodymyr Zelensky told them to get back to their offices and get back to business and carry on, to show the people that the politicians and everyone around, they were not scared about what was happening. Now, perhaps they were, and I imagine many people were scared, but they got on with business. And that's what's happening here in Kiev today. People are going about their everyday business, cars going around, people working. What is happening, though, is that the schools are closing for today as a safety measure. There is an anticipation of missiles being launched by Russia towards the Ukrainian capital. So far, no alerts have been sounded, but we think it's just a question of time before that happens. So the essential word here in Kyiv is that it is business as usual. However, people are on guard.
And President Volodymyr Zelensky, he also has a busy day of commemorations ahead. Tell us more about that.
Busy day, perhaps you know more than me. I think it will be a busy day nonetheless. We know there will be a news conference that Volodymyr Zelensky is holding. Because of security measures, I'm not allowed to tell you when or where, but we're expected to hear something. There was a message that President Zelensky put out via Ukrainian television last night about solidarity, about fighting to the very end, about guarding the country's independence, and basically making sure that everything is done in order to bring the best possible result for Ukraine. Let's now bring you our guest to talk more about the situation. Luke Harding is the Guardian journalist who was for many years in Moscow, but now here in Ukraine. You have a book called Invasion, which is a great summary of the past 12 months. For you, Luke, what are your thoughts today?
Actually, it's quite amazing to be standing here, because if you go back 12 months, the mood in Kiev was one of fear and dread. And I was actually in this square round about this time, and it was completely deserted. There were queues of people trying to leave towards Poland. The routes out west were choked. And there was an expectation, even at the highest levels of government, that Russian troops would probably come into the capital, topple the government, and kind of install a pro-Russian administration. So the fact that Ukraine stands, Kiev stands, people stand, there are joggers over there running around with Ukrainian flags, people walking their dogs, shows us that this war has not turned out the way that Vladimir Putin expected.
How important was it, do you think, a year ago that Zelensky said what he said? You get back to business, don't stay in the bunker, get back to what you're meant to be doing.
I think Zelensky, who, by the way, his poll ratings were slipping a year ago, has turned out to be an extraordinary war leader and a sort of communicator of genius, fated everywhere from Paris to London to Washington. I think the single smartest thing he did, bravest thing he did, was to not flee. The expectation in Moscow is that Zelensky would run away to America, and of course he didn't. And he has really personified this fight back, this underdog struggle against the Russian army and the Kremlin.
The sense today that there would be some kind of Russian response. Do you think that is the same kind of threat that we saw a year ago? Clearly things have changed.
Well, yes. I mean, war has become a kind of normal. I mean, it's sort of terrible normal in which we've seen 8 million people have fled in Europe's biggest conflict since 1945. We've seen about 8,000 civilians killed, flags planted just over there to victims of this conflict. But at the same time, life goes on, and Kiev functions. But I've just been around the front line. I mean, we're talking about more than 1,000 kilometers where you have ruined villages, where you have people living without electricity and water, and you have the constant boom of artillery and shells from across the fields.
It's a massive difference, isn't between what is happening here in Kiev and going back to what you were saying about the front line. Bakhmut, for instance, we were speaking to a soldier who's fresh from Bakhmut. He was telling us about the situation. He showed us images on his mobile phone, which basically looked like the kind of thing you'd see in the First World War. What is happening there is war at its worst.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was on the front line in Zaporizhia in the south recently talking to a drone team. They call themselves Air Reconnaissance. And I was saying, this is David against Goliath. This is the biblical story. And this young man, Michael from Odessa, said, yeah, you know, we are the small guy, they're the big guy. But he added, he says that the small guy knows some tricks. And I think their view is that smart will win this war. I mean, the Russians have so many troops. We've seen mobilization. We've seen 300,000 conscripts thrown into the battle, savage fighting, as you say, around Bakhmut. But the hope, the belief is that with new Western tanks from France, from the UK, from other European countries, from the Americans, that the Ukrainians will be able to do another counteroffensive in the spring, possibly the late spring, similar to the ones that they did in the northeast and the south very successfully last autumn.
In terms of that issue of arms supply, I mean, clearly the message from Zelensky in Ukraine from the very start has been the same. We need arms, we need ammunition. The soldier from Bakhmut was telling us the same thing. The issue is, though, I suppose, that the Allies, the West, NATO, can't get that done quickly enough.
Well, I mean, the politics is interesting. I mean, on the one hand, we've had a formidable anti-Kremlin coalition. And again, Putin, I think, thought that the West would roll over as it did in 2014 when he stole Crimea, annexed Crimea. That hasn't happened. Joe Biden has just been here, the American president, earlier this week. So the coalition is holding up. But I think there's not sufficient clarity in European capitals about what Ukrainian victory means. Does that mean getting back the east, the territory lost since a year ago, or does it mean getting back everything, including Crimea, and restoring Ukraine's 1991 borders? And I actually think the West needs to kind of think about that a bit more and help the Ukrainians finish the job.
We saw from Vladimir Putin, because it's tapping into your Moscow knowledge now, we saw earlier this week Vladimir Putin, Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow, a great sporting event. I've seen a football match there, wonderful thing. But what we saw from Putin was a big sort of self-promoting rally, being his biggest cheerleader, massive propaganda. What's the situation for him? Because clearly, if this result doesn't go here in Ukraine the way he wants it to go, does he face problems?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, Putin is 70 years old. He is comfortable with war. I watched his speech in Moscow. He was repeating the same anti-Western themes. It was a kind of address shot through with paranoia and conspiracy, saying Russia is waging a defensive war rather than a war of aggression. I mean, of course, that's not true, but I think he is prepared for a long war. And his calculation is that eventually, you know, the French voters, British voters, etc., will move on from the war in Ukraine, and he will be able to win. But I do think that's delusional. I mean, here we are in Kiev, as we said. He couldn't take Kiev. He's struggling in the east. It's stalemate, and my sense is that actually Russian soldiers don't really want to fight.
Luke Harding of The Guardian, your book Invasion. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us your insight and analysis. From Maidan Square here in Kiev, and you're back to Charles in the studio.
Mark Owen reporting there from Kiev, from Maidan Square. We'll move on with our coverage, special coverage here with our international affairs editor, Philip Turrell, who's joining us on set now. Hi, Philip. We mentioned it earlier, Russia's aim in this conflict, Russia's aims in this conflict have shifted since their attempt to take over the capital a year ago. But can we say that Russia's war in Ukraine has been a failure?
Well, it depends who you talk to, of course. If you're talking to the Russian side, then everything is normal. The message being given over by Vladimir Putin is this is a special military operation. And if you really want to know what is going on in Russia, then I think you have to turn everything the other way around. We're in a sort of parallel universe in all of this. It's a bit like, as one journalist was saying, Alice in Wonderland, where you're through the looking glass and everything goes the other way round, whereas we are the ones fighting against the aggressors being the Ukrainians and the West and the European Union, who want to take take advantage of the Russian Federation and even launch attacks into Russia. And we were forced into this war by NATO and by the West. It's nothing to do with us. So I think if you look at it that way round, the message coming out, as we've just been hearing from Luke Harding, is one that the Russians are not going to give in whatever happens because they are the ones who are in the right. This is what Vladimir Putin has been saying right from the start of this war. But if you look at the reality on the ground and all the failures that have happened since the start of the invasion of Ukraine exactly a year ago, it's not very good reading for the Russians. You have, for example, 30,000 Russian troops who were forced out of Kherson back over the Dnieper River. You have the attack on the bridge that we were just hearing about, the Kerch Strait bridge linking Russia to Crimea. You have the missile attack at Makiivka, which just came shortly after Vladimir Putin's New Year speech to galvanize support for the Russian offensive in Ukraine, and all these Russian troops that were then killed by a Ukrainian missile attack against their base. So all of these defeats and humiliations for the Russians added on to the fact that everybody knows and everybody's been saying for a year that Vladimir Putin thought this was going to be a flash war that would take 3 days. They would just walk in, take control of the country, and it would be over. I don't think anybody, and even Vladimir Putin himself, thought that a year on the situation would be just as difficult for the Russians as it has been since the start of the war.
And the war, developing as we're speaking. We're getting these wires coming in explaining that Wagner Group, the mercenary group that fights for Russia in Ukraine, is claiming the capture of a small village near Bakhmut. Obviously, these reports not independently verified yet. Moving forward, Philip, can we expect what can we expect from Vladimir Putin? What will bring him to the negotiating table?
At the moment, I don't think anything is going to bring him to the negotiating table, and that's for two reasons. The first one is that Vladimir Putin, in his mind, believes that he is going to win this war, because I think it's gone so far that he can't do anything else. So he believes he's going to win this war. He cannot show any signs in his mind of weakness. He has to keep up this image of the tough Russian president and the leader of all the Russian efforts to take control of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine. So he is not going to give in. The only way that Vladimir Putin will come to the negotiating table is if, as I've been saying quite often in the past, he will get a bloody nose from someone, and then he will feel as though he has only one alternative, and it's better to save what he can and come to the negotiating table. But for the moment, in Vladimir Putin's mind, he has more to gain on the battlefield than actually at the negotiating table. And there are no signs a year on, despite all the problems Russia's had, all the problems within the military forces, the army, the inability to even take the town of Bakhmut, which is what Vladimir Putin really wants to do for this first anniversary. His forces and Wagner forces still haven't managed to do that. So there are signs that the Russian army is weak and badly managed, disorganized, lacking in resilience and the willingness to push ahead with this military invasion into Ukraine. All of those things don't seem to affect Vladimir Putin. He's determined to carry on fighting and has shown absolutely no desire to come to the negotiating table just yet.
Philip, stay with us. We'll come back to you for more insights later in this special edition. Let's get an update now from one of the front lines of this war in the south of the country, in Kherson. The city was quickly taken over by Russian troops in early March of 2022, but a Ukrainian counteroffensive led to the retreat of 30,000 Russian fighters in November, in spite of the annexation of the region by the Kremlin a month earlier. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent is joining us live from there. Catherine, what's become of the city since these Russian troops retreated, and how are the remaining people there feeling on this anniversary of the full-scale invasion?
Good morning, Charles. Well, as you can probably see behind me, the city streets, the city centre of Kherson is more or less deserted. There are a few cars on the streets and people waiting for buses, but this would normally be rush hour in this regional capital. But a lot of the city's population have fled, and they've fled because Russian troops who retreated to just the other side of the Dnieper River, which runs along the banks of this city, have been raining shells down on this city pretty much indiscriminately for months now. And so people who'd started coming back in the hope of resetting up their lives here after 8 months of Russian occupation in this city, well, a lot of those people are already leaving again, and it's eerily quiet here much of the time. People tell me they've been apprehending this anniversary of the first-scale invasion, that perhaps something will happen today, perhaps there'll be a greater intensity of bombing. I've heard, our team has heard several loud explosions this morning ringing out in Kherson. But I want to give you a deeper look inside what daily life is like here on this southern front line. Take a look at this report, which I filmed along with my colleagues Mohamed Farat, Karim Yayawi and Dmitro Kovalchuk. The devastation at Kherson airport is a reminder of the fierce fighting to retake this city. A zone still mined, now surrounded by defensive Ukrainian trenches. But the battle to push forward is frozen.
It's positional warfare, trenches, artillery and drones. We're divided by the Dnipro River.
The front line runs along the river. The edge of the city is deserted and perilous. From the other side, Russian troops send barrages of artillery, machine gun and sniper fire, and Ukrainians strike their positions in turn. Caught in the crossfire are those left of Kherson's population. Every day, people queue for hours at an aid point, handing out food and winter clothes. Outside, waiting in freezing temperatures as explosions ring out, the crowd is growing impatient.
I came here yesterday at 4:30 in the morning to join the queue, but I didn't receive anything. I won't get anything today either.
There's always shelling. It's every day. My nerves can't take it anymore.
For the past 4 months, Kherson has endured daily indiscriminate shelling, emptying the city streets. When Russian troops were forced to withdraw from Kherson in November, this central square was full of celebrating crowds. But that euphoria is long gone. The hardest hit neighborhood is Ostryv, an island on the Dnipro River. Still under Ukrainian control, but the Russians are just a few hundred meters away. Despite all the dangers, this couple is determined to carry on as best they can.
We're staying. It is very frightening. The bombs fly around chaotically. I don't even know where they're coming from. The people who are left here are the most resistant. Firstly, we're worried about what could happen to our homes, and people are patriotic. They don't want to.
A handful of inhabitants are still holding out. We meet the few remaining residents of this tower block, twice hit by shells.
Where would I go? Anyway, there are looters, health problems. I don't have enough money. So where would I go? And who would take me?
To stay or pack up and go, a heart-wrenching decision. Around 100 people leave Kherson by bus every day. Some 85% of the city's population has now fled. Today, the driver's anxious. His minibus has just been hit by shrapnel. Ready to board, a mother and daughter from the neighborhood of Ostryv.
We waited until the last moment in the hope something would change, but we can't bear it anymore. We love our city, we love our home, and we're planning to come back here. We're not leaving forever.
When Ukraine took back Kherson, there was a national outpouring of pride. But the battle is far from over in the south, with the danger not driven far away.
Catherine Norris-Trent and our team in Kherson reporting there. The human and material ravages the war has wreaked on the nation are obvious. However, other wounds aren't as apparent, and psychologists have been working hand in hand with prosecutors whose mission is to look into allegations of war crimes, particularly when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence. What they've been finding is a population traumatized, and they've been seeking to offer support to as many people as they can. Our reporters Luke Shrego and Milina Huet followed some of those psychologists to discover exactly how far their work has gone beyond the scope of its original brief.
Welcome to Zahaltsi, a village about an hour northwest of Kiev. Russian troops entered the area on March 20th, 2022 for about 10 days. Some of the scars of their occupation are obvious, but others below the surface, less so.
У вас є гінекологи, у вас є лікарі, так, але є я, психолог, і ви можете звернутися до мене.
The clinic continues to operate without power as Zahaltsi's residents pass by for checkups, an opportunity for aid groups to assess patients' mental states.
То у вас... Ого, у вас така прям...
У нас, да. Ну, страшно, дуже страшно. Я не могла спать, я такая еще эмоциональная, впечатлительная, еще самолеты летают над головой.
А як спите?
Ну, иногда там успокоительное. Ну, вот я сегодня встала в 3 часа. Из 3 часов я не спала.
For psychologist Irina, moments like this are a chance to discover victims of sexual violence related to the war, or at least get word out that help is available.
Тут є телефон гарячої лінії, вона є анонімною. Можливо, є хтось, я би дуже просила, щоб ви передали, що в цьому немає нічого соромного, що це не їх провина, що з ними трапилося. Це повинні відчувати сором ті, хто це робив, а не ті дівчата, які постраждали за це. Дякую.
Да, теж дякую.
Vasil heads up a Kiev psychological and social aid center. On the ground, he tries not just to raise awareness with locals, but also investigate possible crimes of sexual violence.
Тебе листівки ще є? Є. Хорошо.
95% of the calls he gets are from Ukrainians who just need to talk things through.
А ми психологи з Києва.
У нас специфічна розмова.
Да.
Мені треба психіатр.
Психіатр, так, і психіатр також, в тому числі. А що у вас?
Я зараз вам скажу. Ви розумієте, оце во время війни я знала, що рашисти, що стріляють, що тут таке робили, і ще я стара, там, мені знаєте, а хлопці і роздівали, наколки шукали, і на коліна ставили, і здівалися, хотіли. П'ють, ходять, п'ють, оце до 9 вечора. Після 9 вечора ходять і стріляють. Є по чому, п'яні всі.
Якщо маєте потребу, телефонуйте. На все добре.
Щоб розплакатися, да, наревіться, да.
І це також треба деколи. Плач також допомагає.
Vasil and Irina are currently helping 33 women. Since August, they've worked with around 1,500 under a program set up by the international group Women for Women.
Ну, як вам сказати? Коли за допомогою автомату вказують напрямок руху, то приємного мало.
Psychological ground teams like Vasil and Irina's have a huge task ahead. After a year of war and months of Russian occupation that have scarred Ukraine's collective society, there are still all too many people in need of specialist help.
Well, Ukraine's effort to defend itself has been supported financially by aid from a number of Western countries, chief among them the United States. In 2022, $64 billion was committed to Kiev by the West. That figure will keep rising as the conflict continues, as well as the figure for military aid. The U.S. said on Thursday it'll send Ukraine a new military aid package worth over $2 billion, without mentioning what types of armaments will be included. Kiev also receiving an overwhelming majority of support at the United Nations. 141 countries voting on Thursday to call for Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine, with 7 voting against and 32 abstaining, including China. Philip Turrell, we'll come back to you for this. What effect, if any, will the UN General Assembly vote have on the conflict moving forward?
I think there's going to be 2 effects as far as this is concerned, Charles. The first one is you have to remember this is just a symbolic vote. It doesn't have any effect on forcing Russia to the negotiating table or changing the course of events in the war in Ukraine. So the first effect will be to stack pressure on the Russians to find some kind of solution to the war. Will that have any effect? Nobody really thinks so. I don't think at the United Nations. Maybe they hope it will, but I think at the moment doesn't seem to be any sign of that happening. I think the second effect will be that it will increase support for giving more help to Ukraine and show the countries that maybe are thinking there may be a waning of support within the European Union, from the United States and elsewhere, that the majority of countries in the world are against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. There are two notable exceptions to this. One of them is India, another one is China, and they have not voted against this, but they've abstained. And there are reasons for this. First one is, of course, that China wants to keep a neutral stance in this war and wants to see itself as a kingmaker, coming up with this 12-point peace plan that you were just mentioning. I think there's a lot of suspicion on the part of the West and from the United States, particularly about what role China is actually playing in the war in Ukraine, whether it's supplying weapons or not to the Russians, how China intends to play its cards in the future with its relationship with Russia. Then you have India as well, India which has a special partnership with the Russians, which was a key ally of Russia during the time of the former Soviet Union, and which, with the Russians, wants to create a bipolar world to take the place of the unipolar world, which is run by the United States at the moment. So that explains also, for economic reasons, why India has abstained from voting in favour of this resolution. But I think that the bottom line here is that even though a couple of countries less voted in favour of the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, there is still widespread international support for Russia withdrawing its forces, widespread international criticism of the fact that Russia launched this invasion a year ago, and that doesn't show much sign at the moment of changing anything as far as what the international community thinks, and unfortunately on the reaction from the Russians, who are saying that they are not going to change anything as far as their determination to take control of Ukraine is concerned.
I want to go back to what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now with those statements from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner Group, that mercenary group fighting on behalf of the Kremlin in Ukraine, saying that they've taken over, to have full control of a Ukrainian village called Berkivka, just northwest of Bakhmut. Bakhmut really at the core of the fight there. But this is happening as we've seen obvious discrepancies and conflicts within the ranks of Russia, between this Wagner mercenary group and the actual army on one side.
I think this is an illustration that at the top of the tree, things are not going particularly well for Vladimir Putin. I think there is a lot of confusion going on within the Kremlin about what the best way forward is, how to organize the armed forces. The armed forces in Russia appear to be a kind of patchwork. You have the Russian army, you have generals involved, then you have the Wagner forces, you have people who've been called up during the general mobilization, the 300,000 young people called up to fight in Russia. Then you have others who've been called in from prisons to fight with the Wagner group. It's all sorts of little different parcels of support for the armed forces in Russia that have been put together to try to create some kind of momentum in Ukraine, which hasn't taken off yet. And then at the top of the tree, you now have this fighting going on between the head of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the other members who are in charge of the Russian armed forces, notably Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and the General Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov, and all of this appears to be an argument going on about what the best way forward is concerned. And then you had this argument this week where Yevgeny Prigozhin was saying that he wasn't receiving the necessary weapons to go forward in his fight. And I think that was even another sign. It's not that he's not receiving them, it's just that the Russians don't have the necessary military artillery to supply the Wagner group. So that leads one to believe, well, what is going on at the top of the tree in the Kremlin as far as the organization of this special military operation is concerned? There are a lot of questions being asked about exactly what is going on and how the Russians are going to handle this in the weeks to come.
Philip Turrell, our international affairs editor, thank you. Well, as we've seen, the last year has seen historic changes underway in Ukraine, with the country now fully engaged in its effort to repel the Russian invasion. But how have these events been seen in Russia, and how are they being presented? Vladimir Putin and Kremlin propaganda described the invasion as an effort to, quote, demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, a baseless accusation leveled at Zelensky's government. As the offensive went on, language emerged describing a need to defend Russia's, quote, historical frontiers, and saying that Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people. For more on this perspective, let's turn to our correspondent in Moscow, Daniel Hawkins. Daniel, thanks for joining us. What's the Russian narrative being presented this Friday, and are there any specific events planned?
Well, of course, there's been a big shift, actually, in how this has been presented by the Kremlin. It started off as a very swift, decisive, limited special military operation with consequences that wouldn't be too far-reaching to liberate the Donbass, to demilitarize, denazify Ukraine. The message at the time from the Kremlin was keep calm and carry on, let the professionals do the work. We're going to get through this. That's totally changed as the years gone on. This is now being portrayed as a defining historical life or death standoff between Russia and the collective West and NATO, which is really going to define Russia for the decades and beyond. And everybody bears responsibility for this victory, whether they're on the home front or fighting on the Ukrainian front. This is now being portrayed as way bigger than the Donbass or Ukraine or Crimea. This is a fundamental shake-up of the global order led by the US, with, as Mr. Putin views it, its unilateralism and hegemony and desire to control the rules-based order. In terms of events, I don't think the Kremlin wanted to attach too much significance to today in particular, because it's really not where it wanted to be. Instead of seeing Russian officials, perhaps even Putin himself, in Kiev, we're seeing the US president in Kiev. The Russian army is bogged down. They've got less territory now than they had in spring or summer. So things haven't gone according to plan. And the previous 2 or 3 days have been very rich in events. Yesterday, there was a big fireworks display in Moscow, one of the biggest I've seen in my time here, in honor of the Defender of the Fatherland Day. There was a big patriotic concert in Luzhniki, which Mr. Putin attended, people cheering Russia, Russia, actors dressed up as Russian soldiers throughout the ages. And that was sandwiched, of course, in between Putin's address to Parliament and the visit of China's top foreign policy official to Moscow as well. So the message from the Kremlin really is that Russia was provoked into using force to defend its interests. It's facing an existential threat from NATO and the West. It's everybody's job to participate in this victory. We'll get through it together, and that we're going to come out stronger. Just give us the time and trust us. That's the narrative and the message from the Kremlin, I think, over this weekend.
Daniel Hawkins reporting there from Moscow. Well, if you've been watching France 24 for the past year, you'll know that we've had a constant flow of reporters and correspondents covering the conflict on the ground and gaining invaluable first-hand insights into the war. One of these reporters is France 24's James Andre, and he's joining me on set. You've been to Ukraine 3 times since the full-scale invasion 1 year ago, first in Kiev in March, then back in August, and more recently on the front line in Bakhmut in December. During your first visit in March, the Russians were just a few kilometers away from Kiev. What was the experience of being in the capital at that exact moment?
Well, it was the beginning of the conflict. Nobody really knew which way it was going to be going. Back then, basically, the Russians were in Irpin. The fighting was in Irpin, which is roughly about 10, 15 kilometers from the outskirts of Kiev on the one side. And it was the same situation to the eastern side of the city. So, first needed to get inside the city and decided if you want to stay in case there is a siege of the city or leave. Our team decided we wanted to go in, but we were ready to come out. So we actually had an escape plan with a house we'd rented on the outskirts. And inside the city, well, a lot of people at that stage had fled. It was the beginning of March. So we did see a lot of cars going out, and the city was like completely dead. But what was interesting was to see the Ukrainian society organized to face this Russian invasion and basically get ready. People, for example, were enrolling in the territorial defense. So we met people who were, bakers, butchers, and also, for example, a lawyer who told us as he was actually starting his training and touching a Kalashnikov assault rifle for the very first time, well, look, I'm enrolling for 3 years. And actually that means I'm leaving my civilian status to become a fighter, which under international law makes me a legitimate target for the Russians, but I want to defend my country. Now, we saw all this organized. For example, another person who was an industrial paint producer who shifted his production to bulletproof vests for the army and for the volunteers. And basically all this war effort, ground roots war effort, taking place with the families leaving, the men being forced to stay in the country, because that's a rule since the beginning of, since martial law has been implemented in Ukraine. Men in age of fighting are not allowed to leave. So families were leaving and the men were staying to defend the country. And of course that in itself has put a lot of pressure and tension. For example, a friend of mine in Kiev I spoke to yesterday is incredibly happy because he's going to see his family who was forced to flee to Spain for the first time in a year. He's got 2 small children. You can imagine how hard that is. And the family is coming back from Spain to see if they can reinstall in Ukraine with, satisfactory security conditions.
And more recently, in December, you went to report on the fighting in Bakhmut. At that stage, the Russians were pushing towards the eastern outskirts of the city, and the Ukrainian forces were digging in. And how have things evolved since? And we're getting developments again, as I mentioned earlier today, with Wagner saying that they've taken the locality of Berkivka close to Bakhmut.
Yes, well, indeed, the situation is not very good in Bakhmut. Basically, the Russians are moving forward. Now, I have a couple of maps to show you. Now, the first one was the situation back in December where the footage that we are seeing on the screen next to me was filmed. So basically, at that stage, we were with my colleague Maïsa Awad. We entered Bakhmut. We spent 6 days inside the city and used the road which is to the west of the city on this map, which is this yellow road which passes close to Chassiv Yar. And you can see the northern road, the MO3, was also open at that stage. Now, fast forward to today, where you will see the military situation on the ground with a second map. And when the second map comes up, you really realize that how much, how much land has been taken. Now, that means basically, if you look, the MO3 road to the north is now completely cut and under Russian military control. And if you go to the south of this map, you will see that this road, the M503 that we used to take, 504, sorry, that we used to take to go into Bakhmut from the west, well, that road is now under constant Russian shelling. So basically, you cannot drive into Bakhmut. You need to have authorization from the army at this stage. It's better to go in an armored vehicle. And indeed, the situation in the city is very tense, with what appears to be the Russians encircling it progressively and using this strategy that they've used many times before in this conflict, which is to encircle the city, to just leave one road in and out, and to shell that road in order to take control and to force the fighters out of the city. And this appears to be what's happening right now in Bakhmut. The situation there was already very bad in December. I mean, it's constant shelling. And, well, I can imagine it's even worse now. NGOs have actually been taken out of the city a few days ago. They've been barred from entering because it's deemed too dangerous by the military.
James Andre, thank you very much for sharing your first-hand experience of the front lines in Ukraine. Well, the ripple effects of the war have been felt across the global economy and particularly on food prices. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of grain, so a maritime blockade in the Black Sea had acute effects on wheat, maize, and barley prices around the world. Karis Garland takes a look back at the UN-backed deal that saw the resumption of grain exports from Ukraine and where it stands now.
Bustling with trucks and ships filled with wheat and barley, the Seine River port in Rouen is Western Europe's largest cereal shipping hub. The war in Ukraine has boosted activity even further, exporting to countries like Pakistan, Iran, India, and Saudi Arabia.
The impact on the French market for the current harvest was particularly significant from the month of July onwards, because in the first part of the season, more than 60% of overall activity was carried out by the end of December.
Before the war, Ukraine exported around 9% of the world's wheat, but damage to farmland, grain factories, and a blockade on ships leaving Ukraine's Black Sea ports threatened food security in import-reliant countries. The situation also led to soaring wheat prices, peaking over $500 per ton in May. Prices dropped when a Turkey and UN-backed deal saw the resumption of exports from Ukraine. The deal allowed shipments of grain and fertilizers from 3 Ukrainian ports, and as of January, more than 18 million tons of grain and foodstuffs had been exported. However, the initiative has come under fire for not sending enough cereals to countries most in need. Unless an extension is agreed, the deal is set to expire on March 18th. There are reports Kiev will ask for more ports to be included, but an exact date for negotiations is yet to be confirmed.
Well, one of the countries that's been deeply affected by the conflict is Egypt. Its inflation rate climbing to new records in January. And for more on this, let's speak with our correspondent in Cairo, Edouard Cousin, who's joining us live now. Edouard, how has this crisis, whether it's the crisis in grain supply or the disruptions in the energy markets, how have these affected Egypt?
Well, it has indeed affected Egypt. First of all, because of this wheat supplies. Egypt is one of the largest importers of wheat in the world, and around 80% of its imports come from Ukraine and Russia. So when the war broke out, Egypt was in crisis mode. But a bread crisis, as some feared at the time, did not happen in Egypt. Egypt did find other sources, other markets of wheat, although more expensive, but they managed to keep their wheat supply somewhat in order. Another big impact that the war had was even more severe. Well, when the war broke out, short-term investors pulled their money out of Egypt. So in a few weeks, in March last year, $20 billion flew out of Egypt, which created an immediate dollar shortage, and in response, Egypt imposed inward restrictions. This has spiraled into and triggered several other crises. The inflation hit more than 25% in January, and the Egyptian pound lost about half its value compared to the dollar in 1 year. With an already relatively vulnerable population, they're hit very hard by these price hikes. So yeah, the consequences of the war are felt here.
Oh, and how would you describe the Egyptian government's position in this conflict? They're having to perform a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, a bit. Like Egypt is an ally of the U.S. and they're dependent on the U.S. The U.S. gives military aid of more than $1 billion every year. So they're in that way they're in the U.S. camp. But on the other hand, they have interest with Russia as well. As said, the wheat, Russia is an important wheat supplier. Russian tourists are important for the income and revenues in Egypt. And Russia is building a nuclear power plant here in Egypt as well. So you see in the statements they call on parties to cease hostilities, but they maintain a bit on the surface there. On the other hand, like in the COP27, the climate conference that was held in Egypt in November, President Sisi of Egypt addressed the world and asked world leaders to stop this war because of the major economic consequences for Egypt. So you see they do have a big interest that this war stop for the economy.
Edouard Cousin reporting there from Cairo. Thank you very much. And it's time for the press review, and Solange Mougin is here with us. Solange, you're starting by taking a look at how the papers reacted a year ago to the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I thought I would take you on a sort of time capsule of sorts to take a look back at a few of the front pages and compare them with those of today. Let's start with Libération. There we go. This is their cover of the 25th of February, the reaction to the invasion. It was pure shock, l'impensable, or the unthinkable, it wrote, with the world community. It said being impuissant or powerless. Now, fast forward to today's cover of Libération. It says 1 year, it's quite different. It has 1 year after Ukraine is standing, using the stunning image of a bombed out Ukrainian building. Now, those are the differences. There are also similarities. If we take, for example, the editorial of last year, it's entitled Courage. And then we take the editorial of this year. It is also entitled Courage, hoping last year that the world would jump into action for the courageous Ukrainian people. In today's editorial, Libé says that it is time to take a moment to remember the courage and the steadfastness of the Ukrainians. Now, another comparison comes from Le Parisien aujourd'hui en France. Last year, the paper, it's important to note, Aujourd'hui en France, Le Parisien changes its name depending upon where it's published in France. Last year, it wrote that Putin's attack was a turning point in Ukraine's history. Meanwhile, 1 year later, the same paper, albeit under a different title, says, with an image of Biden and Zelensky, the paper writes, quote, it has been a year that has changed the world. Another comparison, let's take Metro, for example. Last year, it's actually it's doing the comparison for us. It has its headline today and a reminder of the other one, which we see here from last year. It says that Ukrainians stand defiant. Heroes will never give in, even though there are now fields and fields of bodies. Meanwhile, last year, it said war in Europe, comparing Putin to a 21st century Hitler. Now, a final comparison. This comes from the Washington Post. It has a then and now cartoon, and it says it's entitled Shell Shock. Michael de Adder has Putin slowly rolling into an upside-down plan into Ukraine, and now a year later, it is not going as planned. He is upside down, or at least his army may be buried in the snow.
Well, in addition to comparisons of the past and present, the papers are also discussing what the future could hold in this war.
Yeah, staying with the Washington Post, they have an opinion piece today that walks us through how this could end. By using a number of charts, they have researchers who explain that the initial surge of Russian forces and then the Ukrainian pushback has now resulted in what is mostly a stalemate. Meanwhile, The Atlantic, it polled researchers, and it argues that these researchers and analysts said that while the war in general is unpredictable, this easily could become a shape-shifting, decades-long conflict. Now, another take on the future, The Guardian says that already this war has reshaped the world order in a way, but not, it argues, in the China-Russia alliance versus the West. Rather, it argues that many leaders in the global South, even in democracies, are cynical about, quote, the grand declarations of Western leaders backing Ukraine to defend democracy, end quote. The Guardian says the future will be less about those that support and those that do not support the Ukrainians in this war, and more about distinct interests of each regional power. Now, in this line of thought, the New York Times has a really interesting article that draws out the degrees to which nations have supported or not Ukraine and shunned Russia. There are those that support the 141 that support at the UN an unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops. But then, if you look at other parameters, like this graph here from the same article, if you look at other parameters, exports, vocal support, arms, sending of arms, the global unification, it writes, against Russia is a lot more nuanced and a lot more splintered than it seems.
And finally, Solange, you found a few little beacons of hope in this 1 year, on this 1 year mark of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and they come namely in the form of the arts. If we take The New Yorker, for example, it describes how most theaters and performances were immediately ceased at the start of the war. But there is now a drama troupe in Kharkiv that's kept on playing for spectators, except they now do it in a private home, a way to continue to share and express the arts with each other without the dangers of being in a targetable, packed theater. Now, another artwork that's also inspired us over this past year are those of Banksy's street arts in Ukraine. Forbes tells us it is now, one of the drawings is now protected behind impact-resistant glass and actually has a security system so that it can stick around as, quote, a reminder that light must overcome darkness. Now, one of the Banksy images is actually becoming a Ukrainian stamp for this 1 year mark. It's of a little boy karate chopping a man, a much bigger man, and it's entitled Putin, Go F Yourself. The commemorative stamp is actually one of 30 that the post office released this year, with the post office CEO saying, quote, Ukrainians collect the stamps as history, and it has now become a symbol of our fight for freedom. It is, in essence, a time capsule of sorts for Ukrainians and for the world to remember this very difficult year.
Solange Mougin, thank you very much for that press review. That wraps this special edition about the war in Ukraine a year after Russia's invasion, a tragic anniversary that was marked in Paris with the Eiffel Tower illuminated in the colors of the Ukrainian flag in solidarity with Kiev. French President Emmanuel Macron saying this morning that France is on the side of Ukraine and calling for their victory. We'll leave you on these pictures, but stay tuned to France 24. Alison Sargent will be with you in just a few minutes for more coverage of this anniversary, as well as other world news.